Okay, so we're all set? Great. So good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming, both in person and for everyone who's joining us online. My name is Colleen Sullivan, and I am this year's SGA, Slice Europe SGA's president. So tonight's Bologna Institute for Policy Research talk was organized by the SGA with contributions from the student body. And so the members of the executive board are up here joining me this evening as the student panel. And we are thrilled to have Professor Regina Smyth with us. Professor Smyth is a professor of political science at Indiana University, where she teaches courses on comparative politics, protest movements, and Russian politics. She is also a graduate from Duke University, where she received her PhD. And her primary research interest is in the dynamics of state-society relations in transnational and electoral authoritarian regimes. She has also written extensively on political development in the Russian Federation, and she recently published her latest book, Elections, Protest, and Authoritarian Regime Stability, Russia from 2008 to 2020. And tonight she is going to delve into the Russian societal response to Putin's war in Ukraine, protest capacity, and the factors that shape action and inaction in the face of war. So welcome, Professor Smyth, and we'll go ahead and share your presentation.
Up and down. Okay. Thank you for coming here tonight. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's just a pleasure to be here in Bologna, and I was able to tell my students that I had been invited by students, which made me very happy. And they said to convey to you that you made an excellent choice. But I think they really only wanted better grades. I don't think so. So what I want to do tonight is to talk to you a little bit about the work I've been doing for the better part of a decade. And the conclusion from that work, I think, or the conclusion I make from that work, is that the capacity of Russian civil society, Russian organization, is often underestimated, profoundly underestimated, that society in Russia has progressively changed over time. And then address the puzzle on the basis of the work I've been doing. Why is it then that we don't see a bigger anti-war movement, or why is it that we see so much support for this war in the recent days? So, and most of my work is empirical. It's based on surveys and original data collection, and I'm going to present some of that data today. So here it is. Here's my my latest work. I'm going to touch on each one of these 4 projects, beginning with the book, which dealt with capacity to organize both protests around elections, but protest within elections, and how that influenced both the formation of the opposition and the state's response. And then I'll go on to talk about these other projects. So the takeaway from my book is also the starting point, which is when we talk about autocratic elections, we shouldn't really even be using the word election, that these are in no way elections. They're foregone conclusions. So the fight then is over the information revealed by the election process. And so information as the currency of elections. And here the idea, and the book has a game theoretic model in it, so it's a signaling game if you're interested in that kind of thing, is that strategies chosen by the elite, the government and the opposition reveal information that they otherwise would not have wanted to reveal. So for example, when you ban candidates from running, you're signaling you're afraid those candidates are popular. When you make people come from their university to vote, coerce them into that, you're signaling that you're afraid people won't turn out otherwise. So these are information signals about the vulnerability of the system. The role of the opposition then in this story is to reveal support for the opposition or lack of support for the regime. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why they have so few opportunities to do that, why that's so constrained. And the last conclusion of the book is that what this turns politics into is almost a permanent electoral campaign, where everything that's being done is being done with the eye towards the next election or the effect on the next election. And that becomes important, not when we explain so much why war in Ukraine, but the timing of war in Ukraine, right? I think that that's an important part of the story. And the big empirical takeaway of the book that really does look at the elections between 2008 and 2021 actually, is that the stability in Russian outcomes always look like this, a 2/3 support for either the presidential party or the president, masks an enormous change in the system that delivers those numbers. So President Putin, Russians, even we like to talk about stability in Russia, but if you look closely, there's very little stability. There's almost constant change in the strategies that the regime is using. And this extends all the way to rules governing candidate and party access, to the growing use of hidden repression, stuff that you may not notice because it occurs months and years before an election is held. Things like depriving opposition organizations of being able to rent office space is a common strategy. Harassment and arrest of opposition figures. And then these vote mobilization drives. And most recently, new tools of just simply falsifying the vote, literally falsifying the vote. And we can talk about what that looks like in Q&A if you're interested. So here I have Alexei Navalny, who emerges as a little bit of a hero in my book, but this applies to other groups as well. What's left for the opposition? Well, what's left is to unify as best they can and present a united front. That will increase the in the election, that will increase the probability of gaining more votes and also increase the probability of protest if there's a fraudulent election. We know this already by lots of work done by Don Brancati and other people who tell us across authoritarian states when oppositions unify, they do better. It's a better situation. In Navalny's case, he went one step further and politicized the electoral process. And by that, I mean, he knew he couldn't win, but he persisted in running and changing the way that elections were run, running and challenging the system, running and linking elections and protest in a way that really brought more politicized elections, made elections important, brought more people into the electoral process, made elections, especially local elections, more relevant, and so forth. I know that it's very common if you're a Russia watcher to hear no one likes Navalny anyway. It's true that Navalny's support is quite low, about 20% in some survey data I'll show you later. This time last year, so survey data of this time last year, his popularity had gone up. People may not like him, but they like his ideas and they like his strategies. And we so often don't make that distinction between what Navalny as a man and Navalny as a strategist. So you may ask in that conclusion, then if I'm right, why no protest in fall 2021, which was a highly falsified election amidst COVID? And I would argue that in my book, it shows that the Navalny protest, the repression that the state used to put the Navalny protest was decisive in this election. That is, by repressing and making sure that the protest couldn't happen, the regime signaled it was going to win at all costs. And that deterred people from taking risks. And this continues to be the case today, right? The regime is signaling it will win at all costs. And the idea that Putin again will win, that Putin always wins, plays a role of deterrent in people's decisions to protest. Nonetheless, the Navalny protests themselves increased social capacity for protest. We saw protests expand out of large cities into small towns across the Russian Federation, linking together and sort of demonstrating both growing opposition and also growing societal capacity to self-mobilize or organize. The state responded with these incredibly strong signals, in particular, shutting down both Navalny's organization, other opposition organizations, and also independent media. If you were watching during this time of the 2021 protest, what we learned was how much vibrant independent media there actually was in the Russian regions. And much of that is now moved into the diaspora, is reconstituting itself. And there's really quite good analysis out there on these independent media. The last thing we learned, which was the takeaway of the book also, was United Russia's total failure to make any connection to ties to voters. So Putin built United Russia as an electoral vehicle. It's a great coordination mechanism for elites to monitor elites, to know what's happening in the regions. It has virtually no connection to the broader Russian population. The core United Russia vote, as polls by the president's administration and by Levada showed, less than 30% of people support this party or want to vote for it without prompting or coercion. So that was sort of the starting point for the work that I started to do. Subsequently, which was focused on the Moscow housing renovation program. And this may seem like a big jump, but it's also focused on societal capacity and state evolution. This was, oh, I lost a slide. Sorry, they're out of order. This was a project built to renovate these buildings called Khrushchevki, built between 1958 and 1972 to enable the reindustrialization and growth of Moscow. They were built as the first private housing in Russia after, well, there was a small bit of that under Stalin, but the first large-scale building under Russia and it provided people for the first time with private apartments. But they were built to only last for 25 years. They were built quickly. It was a temporary fix. There were lots of problems with these buildings. Let's see. On your left, you see that they're prefabbed cement buildings that were built. These are them being constructed. This is from 1961. And on the right, you see a montage of photos that show the condition of the buildings today. So they were in poor shape. Nonetheless, the point of this project was not to modernize housing per se. The point of this project was urbanization and modernization to support the middle class. Urbanization and modernization to win social support. This has been a strategy not only of Russia, but also of China to use these processes of bringing people into the cities, giving them a better, easier, cleaner environment in which to live. The picture is Zaryadye Park, constructed a couple of years ago by the same guys who brought you the High Line project in New York City, right? So here there's a real investment in creating these social spaces, new lights, new sidewalks, filling the potholes, better roads, and also housing. The second thing this housing project was designed to do was to create authoritarian responsiveness. That is to anticipate what society wanted before they could complain, and therefore appear to be a responsive government, right? And then the last was to draw contentious politics and protest into away from contesting the regime and towards contesting big policy. So this was an important development, and it gave us a nice, clear picture of what opposition and support look like in Russia. And this is quite a complex picture, right? So there is anti-regime or Putin opposition that mobilizes, but around issues that are called non-political. And those are these issues about everyday life contestation. What we see is more policy focused competition. And here people aren't even opposing the policy often. They're opposing some provisions of the policy, of trying to make the policy better. So they're engaging in protest, contentious action, but in order to improve the system. Equally, regime support is complicated. There are some people who are enthusiastically supportive, especially in these sort of non-political issues, because they are getting things. They're getting things they could not afford otherwise. Most Muscovites could not afford a new apartment, and here they are being given a new apartment as their old buildings are torn down and they're offered housing in new buildings. And here that's rooted in a straight rational calculation, economic gains. Very few of it is direct political support. Some of it is, but very little. Then there's the support that's more, I would say, shaky, which is about disengaged or resigned. So this project included both data collected through a really nifty survey, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also in terms of focus groups. And here we see a lot of people saying, why bother? They're going to do what they're going to do anyway. Why even try to mobilize or influence? Take the money and run. That sort of attitude. This is Yulia Galyamina, who is a housing activist, Moscow deputy, been arrested and jailed several times and is now exiled because she was threatened with really serious jail time. So the work we did, the statistical work, which was quite sophisticated and hopefully coming to a journal near you very soon, showed that if you lived in it, so what we did in the survey was survey people who lived in Khrushchevsky who were included in the project and those who were not included. So we could directly compare the effect of being under the policy across the two groups. And what we found was that living in selected buildings increased pro-sociality, another fancy economist word for social capital. So that the policy and having to respond to the policy really increased social interaction and increased positive norms due to the policy-based interaction spontaneously from above, mostly, but also from top down. We also found that pro-sociality increased in participation in local elections. Moscow local elections became salient again because they were tied to these important policies. People who were active in the anti-renovation program, often called the demolition program, SNOS, they went to candidate schools and they were taught how to be candidates in local elections. And you see from the map in 2019, even with many candidates being barred from running, many progressive candidates being barred from running, there was still the United Russia lost about a third of its seats that it had previously held in the Moscow Duma. We went on with a group of young scholars from Russia, Europe, and the US to look at these non-political types of everyday life protests across Russia. And we focused on a lot of cases. This is from one of the papers that focused on language use in Tatarstan in the wake of new language laws. We also looked at beautification programs in Sosnovy Bor, where a group of young people moved from being graffiti artists and taggers into getting presidential grants to build and beautify the system. The role of the church in joining with civic activists in order to take care of disabled workers, and also the food delivery workers during COVID who collaborated quite extensively to get better working conditions. And we see across all of these dynamics, as you see, if you've looked at the trash protests or the protests around maternal benefits, really an increased level of these spontaneous and then slowly organizing non-political actions that spanned existing organizations like the church. And here in non-political stages, they're engaged in all sorts of contentious politics repertoire, from what we're using to see, right, together to protect medicine. We're seeing all of these pickets, protests, the symbolic actions that you see, the organization of local NGOs, including NGOs that teach other people how to apply for presidential administration funding to pursue these kinds of local goals. We see a lot of mobilization about providing new information about how government is working, what government's doing, the usual kinds of petitions, collaboration on service provision, and so on. So we've seen this really deepening and expanding of repertoire, the interaction of civic society with local and regional government, and really a growth in sort of spontaneous mobilization and organization. The last work I want to talk about speaks directly to what's been going on. I was lucky to be included by Paul Kolstow and Helga Blekesrud, who have written extensively out of Oslo about Russian conservative values. And we put a survey in the field, which was trying to get a better sense of when people might protest and when they weren't. So usually when we talk about protest capacity, we ask a single question, right? And the single question is, if there was a protest in your town today, would you attend? Now, you probably want to say, ask me a lot of questions. What would the protest be about? Is it sanctioned by the state or unsanctioned? How dangerous would it be for me to show up? And that's exactly what we tried to do in this survey. We did a survey experiment where people were prompted by, now I'm going to ask you a series of issues about participation in sanctioned or unsanctioned protests. For each one of these issue areas, tell me if you would condone protesting, if you think protesting is a good idea, and whether or not you would participate. And here are the issues we asked about. Will government act on its promises? Will it be accountable? The environment, human rights, you can see. Notice as we go down to the end, the more contentious issues, pensions, economic decline, election fraud, already we see a little drop off, but this is remarkably high number of people willing to, or saying that they would be willing to protest across these issues in a sanctioned protest. And that means the local government has said it's okay to come. This is a really high number. It doesn't surprise me, and I don't think it's false for this reason. One, I've played with the data a lot, and it correlates to other statistical attributes of people. But the other reason that I don't think it's false is this survey was conducted a month ago at this time, at the height of the Navalny protests, when protests were still seeming like a good idea, like a good action. On the far right here, you see the two pro-government sources, Russian values and support for the government. Note that people are much less willing to turn out and protest spontaneously for that. They may be easily mobilized, but they're not really easily, they don't go to the street. This, don't be afraid, there aren't too many of these. This reports two factor analysis. And factor analysis is just showing us how these issues hang together. And what I expected here would be, there would be three factors. There would be a factor that was non-political protest, and a factor that was political protest, and then a sort of residual factor. But here what you see, whether it's sanctioned or unsanctioned protest, people they're now one factor. Those ideas are linked. If you're willing to protest, you're willing to protest statistically as a regularity, you're willing to protest at a high level of issues. And we also see that in unsanctioned, if we look on the other side, on the left is anti-government issues, on the right in each section is pro-government issues. You see that in the pro-government, only Russian values and support for the government load on that second factor. This tells us Russian society is polarized. We're seeing polarization between people who support the government, who are a minority in this survey, and people who do not support the government. If we look even deeper into this, here we have all issues that, except for support for the government, so these are all opposition issues. On the right is the sanctioned protest, on the left in each pair is unsanctioned. you're seeing that when the state says, now we're going to sanction protest, that it affects people in two ways. The first way is to say, I'm not interested in that issue. I'm not as interested in that issue as I thought I was. And the second is, I'm also not going to go to protest. So there are two mechanisms happening here. It's not as simple as people are just afraid or intimidated. It's something quite a bit stronger than that. And this really deserves a deeper investigation. Notice on the pro-government side, they don't want to protest at all. And there's also higher sort of uncertainty, I'm not sure, especially for sanctioned protest, right? So, unsanctioned protests. So even unsanctioned protests that are pro-government, people don't want to go. And this looks like what I saw in 2011, 2012 in the For Fair Elections movement, where pro-government, people who went to pro-government rallies were as afraid of the police as people who went to anti-government rallies. So we see this sort of consistent fear of the police. These things, this is just statistical significance. If we compare the mean of sanctioned and unsanctioned, all of these bars are statistically significant. In some cases, they don't make much difference. In other cases, they do, right? Notice that economic decline and election fraud, the difference between sanctioned and unsanctioned are lower. That's because of a very interesting finding. Lots of Putin supporters go to the other types of issue protests. Lots of Putin supporters even go when it's, well, certainly about health, about human rights, about pensions, about the environment, and even about accountability. When it's about economic decline or election fraud, Putin supporters drop out. And that's what you're seeing there. So protests around those issues become more polarized and more fractious. And then you see even on government support, there's a big difference between sanctioned and unsanctioned protests. Okay, so what does this tell us? If we think about Russia in that way, through this lens, what does it tell us about both support for the war and public opposition to the war? And the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine. I want to be really careful about my language. And I also want to tell you that here I'm not apologizing for everyone, just trying to understand, right? I think I've been in this business for 30 years. This has been a really tough couple of months. Done quite a bit of work on protest in Ukraine as well. And I think all of us who have been doing this for a long time are struggling, as I am. So this thinking comes out of how does my work help me make sense of what's happening now? So I want to start with, you probably have seen this, it's really been going around. There was a list experiment. So we've seen a lot of surveys of Russians about the war, and support for the war has ranged from the mid 80% supporting the war to this list experiment finding that shows just over 50%, 53% supporting the war. List experiments, you may know, work by, you never have to say what you support or don't support. You're only shown a list of things and you say, how many of these things do you support? So you never have to say, I don't support the war. You only have to say, I only support 2 of these 4 things or 3 of these 4 things. If you ask the direct question, Chapkovsky and Schaub find over 70% support. If you ask it with the list experiment, it goes down. That shows that fear is happening. I'm not sure this still captures the sentiment of the moment. First of all, the moment is changing day by day. Secondly, I haven't seen the report of the response rate here, but we are seeing that people who support the war are more likely to respond to surveys than people who don't support the war. But there are also other things going on in these numbers that I think should make us all cautious. It's a brilliant attempt and it tells us something very interesting, but there's much work to do in understanding support. The first is the Putin factor. So for about 30% of the population, They're not thinking about the war at all. Any question they're asked, they're thinking about Putin. Do I support Putin or not support Putin? And about 30% of people are Putin's core support. No matter what happens, the only thing that's going to make them change their position on something difficult like the war is that they change their position on support for Putin. And that's a very complicated question. We could talk about that in Q&A if you like. I also couldn't resist putting Kirill here to foreshadow some of the other things I'm going to talk about in a second. The second thing that we forgot and need to be really mindful of is that foreign policy assessments and public opinion in Russia have always been different from domestic policy. That is, citizens tend to trust the state media more on foreign policy. They discount alternative sources on foreign policy, and they focus on blame attribution rather than factual events. So they may know events, but they're focusing on who's responsible for those events. That's different from how public opinion works in domestic policy. And I first came across this again in the book work, where we asked about information sources on things like the Arab awakening, which was happening contemporaneously with Russian protests. People were relying on different sources. They were more likely to rely on state sources. They were more likely to say they trusted those sources. And they were much more likely to say that while they supported for fair elections, even if they didn't go, they did not support protest in the Arab Spring, which was thought to be destabilizing. And that reflected the narrative, the state narrative on state television. So we have to bear in mind all the time that these are different kinds of issues and people are responding to disinformation and information differently. A lot of people are talking about public opinion as a rally around the flag effect. And here I want to remind us that rally around the flag effects are often very short-lived, but also that this is quite a unique version of rally around the flag. The first is that even though there's been a lot of talk of how the Putin regime didn't think through the symbol of the Z and the way to sell the war, probably because it didn't expect an actual war, we do see that the rapid response and the use of spec operation really locked in people's opinions early. So they managed to control information in the first couple of days. They managed to get control of the narrative. They managed to create symbols, and they managed to lock in some pretty strong opinions in the beginning of the situation. Those are harder. Now you're changing people's minds, right? So that's not going to be just a straight information story. The information control, nonetheless, is very important. It's having two effects as far as I can tell, and here I'm going from the anecdotal data. It's either people are choosing among the information being offered them to confirm, we'll talk about that in a second, or they're simply tuning out because they're hearing almost the same thing over and over again. And they're saying enough negativity. This is the word we're seeing a lot, negativity, enough negativity. People in Ukraine are being negative. You see that in a lot of interviews. And that's a sign of turning off, right, of dismissing. What this effect is built on 20 years almost of a narrative about the Soviet Union being beleaguered, the Soviet Union always being the victim, Russia, so sorry, see now I'm there. Russia always being the victim, Russia being beleaguered, Russia being threatened constantly, and then the narrative about Ukraine as being part of Russia, a lost part of Russia, Krim Nash being so successful. We see a lot of emotion, and the regime's been very good about not only stirring up emotion, but telling people what kind of emotion they should have. So there's been a lot of instruction about what people can talk about or not talk about. And the last element of this rally around the flag, I think, has to do with normalization. So many Russians, although this is starting to crack, are still saying, this is just 2014 all over again. We weathered that, we came through okay, we can't make a big deal with it. We are very strong, we can deal with this. If you saw the Russian central bank leader Navalny's press conference last week, she told Russians pretty clearly, it's that story is over. Russia is in the process of transformation, by which she meant deindustrialization. Navalny is famous for wearing brooches on her clothes to signal the state of the world. She was wearing a cloud with raindrops falling at that press conference. And I would have given you the picture of that, but it appears to have been scrubbed from the web, literally. Like I could not find the picture, which it is in itself fascinating. To underscore the narrative, this is quite a beautiful, affecting memorial to World War II lost soldiers whose bodies are still in the fields and in the bogs and have never been recovered. The regime has done an amazing job of overcoming pocketbook information. So on the one hand, they're getting a lot of information from the state about what's happening in Russia, what will happen. And on the other hand, they're getting information from their daily lives, from economic conditions. So here on the top, in terms both of inflation and the value of the ruble, the regime has intervened, Navalny herself, and now she's under sanction by EU members, not the EU itself, some EU members. They have returned both the inflation and the value of the ruble levels to about pre-war levels. People are taking this as a sign that the government can manage, as they managed in 2014, that the hysteria is over. What Navalny, who has tried to quit twice reportedly and has been not allowed to quit because that would be a real signal of instability, is saying is that this cannot last. There's not enough reserves to keep this going. We're seeing the repression disengagement dynamic, where people who are experiencing repression are disengaging from politics. We're seeing a lot, we're also seeing right now, mostly in the anecdotal data, things like Info and other sources of what's happening, that opposition seems to be on the uptick. We're seeing increased opposition to the war. Sam Green is calling this a red line theory, that the opposition is figuring out what the red lines are of repression, and it's emboldening them to start acting going up to that line and no further. Now, of course, that presumes that this is a normal authoritarian state that will keep moving the line. That line moved today with a new law in the Duma, where you don't have to be getting money from a foreign source to be a foreign agent. You just have to be saying things that are echoing foreign sources, right? So we're seeing that line constantly moving. Jeremy Morris, a spectacular anthropologist who blogs at postsocialism.com, you can find him, calls this defensive consolidation. People don't support the war, but they do support the fact that Russia's been under threat for so long, and given the choice between being a traitor and supporting the government's policy, they support the government's policy, so that this is an intervening variable. We see a lot of discussion of preference falsification. Olya Onich just has been writing about this. Maria Snegovaya has a nice piece in Journal of Democracy about cognitive dissonance and the selection of information. If you're interested in these theories, there's a lot of talk of learned helplessness, which resonates with these things. And then, of course, social desirability bias, which is to say the thing that everybody else is saying in your close circle until the opinions of your close circle change. I would say that each one of these theories is right, that this is an extraordinarily complex moment, that different people are having different responses, and it's not quite clear how it's gonna separate out. I was on Info today, and there were 10 or 12 new protest events within the hour that I had logged on. These are single picket kind of events. People don't seem to be being charged with treason for them. So that might be consistent with red line. So I'm gonna end there and we can talk about it. I'll just leave you, there was a lot of protest around Easter celebration against the war, some of it quite creative and beautiful, actually. And here is one of them, Kvatit enough of war. So that's where I'll end, and we can talk about.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was a very interesting talk. I learned a lot, I think, about Russian society. So for those of you in the audience and watching online, we are going to open with some questions from the student panel, and then we're going to turn to audience. For those of you online, if you would please put your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat, that would be great. And we have it up here, so we will be taking questions online as well. But to kick it off, I'm going to start. Hi, my name is Colleen again, for those of you tuning in late. And I wanted to ask, you mentioned that it's not necessarily about support for the war, but rather not people support Putin. And he is someone who's demonstrated that he's had a lot of care and consideration for his personal image as this strong, powerful man. Do you think that he only ever really planned for this best case scenario, meaning a quick takeover of Ukraine? And do you think this is something that's going to impact his domestic image at home? So we'll turn it over to you for that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's not a small question, right? So I will give you my opinion. I'm sure there are many people who disagree with me, but as a social scientist, when I think about why the war, as I said in the beginning, I think not only about why the war with Ukraine, but at this moment in this way. So I think that Putin has, in my estimation, gotten bad advice 3 times in his career. Really bad advice. I'm sure he's got smaller bad advice. The first time was when he and Vyacheslav Surkov decided that Russia would be modernized by 2020. And that didn't work out. And as soon as that became clear, Surkov was out, right? Replaced by Volodin. And I'll stop doing the inside Russia thing in a second. But also notice that Surkov is one of the people under house arrest now. So he's gotten very, very bad advice. The second bad advice I think Putin got was that the tandem would work without problems in society and in the elite. And that turned out also to not be the case. Many people were fired and moved around because of that one. And then he got advice that this war would proceed as Crimea did. There was clearly both a profound misunderstanding of the sentiment in Ukraine, the type of national unity that we've seen, the capacity of the regime, the willingness of the West and the US to organize behind Ukraine. All of those things were underestimated. In addition, they overestimated the capacity of the Russian military. And we can talk a little bit, if you like, about why Russian military performed so badly, but it did. And so I think that he really did only think that this was going to be the best case. I think there's been a lot of talk about whether Mr. Putin is ill or otherwise incapacitated. I think he's enraged and sort of for the first time in a long time, maybe a little befuddled about how to proceed. This is a classic dictator's dilemma story, right? Where the person at the top doesn't know what's the reality is at the bottom. And the people at the bottom have no incentive to educate him because then they're contradicting what he wants. And so I think what we've seen is just a massive blunder. And he does clearly care about public opinion now. They're carefully managing news about deaths. They're carefully managing news about the cost of this action. They're carefully managing the reality of the butchery in Ukraine and the attacks on civilian lives. So, and also, I just saw a bunch of stories that said Putin's also worried about being weak. So he has spent since 2012, this is a very long answer, I'm sorry. He's spent since 2012, billions of dollars modernizing a military which has failed catastrophically. In any other country, can you imagine what that would look like? And so of course he's worried about these kinds of things becoming very known and very clear people in their close circles start to talk about them, and the government looks incompetent. So he's worried about being strong in this case, which may be why we're seeing a shift to the east and the move towards the south.
And I guess I would also follow that up with, I know his image, at least in world news, has been that yes, he's a little, maybe he's ill, maybe he's infirm, maybe he's sort of losing it. And then, you know, the other side where Zelensky is getting all this attention of like, wow, he's just like the hottest thing since sliced bread. So I wonder if that's sort of driving him a bit nuts as well. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to Adele for our next question.
So I just had a simple question, but if Putin was to lose power, what do you think that new regime would look like? And I have a second one as well. We can just put it together. And if Putin is so popular, why do they have to resort to such brutal measures when it comes to would-be protesters?
Okay, so those are neither small questions. Neither of those questions are small questions. Let me talk about the first one. I sort of hinted in the talk that I don't believe Putin is as popular as we believe. I mean, Putin has great PR, right? And we still believe that Putin is in charge of everything that happens in Russia. Now, we were mistaken about whether Putin was in charge of sending troops into Ukraine. Clearly, we were mistaken about that. Again, I would be careful, though. There's a difference between domestic and international politics. So he can't simply order people to register for the military, for example. They're having trouble meeting quotas across the region. The state is still offering incentives that are big enough to attract in the poorest regions of Russia, but they're having trouble attracting the kind of soldier they want, a more sophisticated technical soldier. So I think that he's not that popular, and particularly if you think that this popularity is built on having eliminated anyone who could possibly replace him. Right, I think that's the real important question. And this is why, and you all can help me, and this is something I'm wrestling with now, how do we talk about elections that preclude other people from rising from the bottom and contesting? Certainly that's not an election. Election is the wrong word. Selection doesn't really feel like the right word either, but this is something I'm wrestling with. I think our language has been misleading, and thus we believe things that are not true. Second, what will come next? If you had asked me this before the war started, I would have said and this will probably be highly unpopular, a technocratic government led by a combination of people like Navalny behind the scenes, some of the more liberal, again, wrong word, sorry, oligarchs who want to preserve international trade and not get involved in autarky, and people like Sergei Sobyanin, mayor of Moscow, or even Prime Minister Mishustin, who is thought to be a pretty good manager. And I would have thought that maybe the West could work with people, and I hate to say the West, but at some point, sanctions are going to have to be dealt with, right? And so there'll have to be a government to remove sanctions. It'll have to be a government that the West feels comfortable with. And so I thought maybe that would be a government. That turns out to be wishful thinking for a couple of reasons. One is that Sobyanin and Mishustin are already truly compromised in this war. Mishustin by reporting on other people, Sobyanin because Putin keeps making him show up with him on the stage to support these things. He was with Putin at the Easter service yesterday. So I'm not so, there's a very nice piece in Riddle, if you're a Russian watcher and you're not reading Riddle, which is a Russian publication still being published in exile, about why some of these the party of war is so supportive of the war, what they hope to get out of it. That piece posits that those people would like to be in charge if Putin goes. That seems unlikely to me because they won't be supported by other elites. So who's missing from this picture? The military. It's not well represented in any discussion or any thought of what's next. The military, except for Shoigu, who has no military actual fighting experience, is not been involved. So that's a long way of saying, I don't know. but I don't think it's going to look like we expected, which is some crazy nationalist pro-war coalition. But I also don't think it's going to look like the technocratic stable coalition that I thought we might see form. And it's really hard to map the alternatives beyond that. Maybe you all have ideas.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna turn it over to Benjamin next.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I sort of wanted to piggyback or slightly backtrack from that previous question, because implied is that there would be a changeover of government, or that Putin would lose, kind of thing. How realistic of a prospect do you think it would be that, you know, if he does lose, well, this spells the end of Putin, kind of thing? Is that wishful thinking, or is there a real basis for that?
Well, there's certainly, we saw some interesting statements by both the US Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State Blinken yesterday, who said it could go on for some time and Putin may be there for some time. We also saw today Macron, after election, saying he intended to play the role of negotiator between Putin and the West, which maybe looks a little like the West now, but for how long? Again, that's not my area, but that's something I'm thinking a lot about. I find it very, very hard. So I find it hard to believe that Putin can win another election. I mean, he can control another election, but I think his personal popularity within 2 years is going to be a lot smaller. Now, I've been wrong. We all have wishful thinking. I've been wrong about what will trigger a defection from Putin. In this case, it will take people blaming Putin for the management of the war. We know that he's also taken action by arresting people. We know that he's launched investigations about how conscripts got into Ukraine. He was shocked by that outcome. Maybe they're not telling him, but the gap between what's real and what Putin is saying is growing, and that information is going to become available. And that's the thing to watch, the size of the gap and what people say. I think the other thing to watch is what the police start doing. So if you start, when you look at OVD info or other info about protests, there's really pretty big variation, regional variation in what regional police and regional courts are doing. Some people are getting arrested and getting let go. Some people are being arrested and fined for their actions. Other people are being charged with more significant crimes. So, and I'm just starting to look at that data. And aside from telling you there's big variation, I can't tell you which regions yet, but we are seeing a lot of regional variation. And I think this is really interesting and really telling. And that says to me that the legal system is operating differently in different regions. And if one police force, we've seen reports of a couple of Rosgvardia troops who refused to be recruited and sent to Ukraine, the riot police troops who have just refused to go. If we start seeing more police action, I think we're going to see change fast. So.
And next, Carter.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about how in the initial stages of the war, citizens of Russia were kind of digesting that information and forming their own opinions. And so one thing that I'd love to ask is that in the beginning, or there have been lots of reports that allege in the beginning, a lot of Russians didn't necessarily know what the full scope or expected scope was going to be in Ukraine. Do you think that that's true, or there was a little bit more understanding than maybe those reports have led on? And I mean, I guess it's changed a lot since then, but how will that adapt?
So I think it's absolutely true. And there's been some really good reporting lately that the people in charge of this action were security people. They were not military people, and they prized secrecy over preparedness. That was one of the problems that we saw with this war. We have plenty of evidence now, captured evidence on the battlefield about what was going on. I don't know if you've been listening to these intercepted conversations between Russian soldiers and their families back home. that they really did not know until very soon before they were going into Ukraine what they were going to do. And their parents and families did not know where they were being sent. And that was really part of only one part, but part of the problem that the military faced in Ukraine. So we've seen, so I think it's absolutely true. It came from several different levels. One thing I will say is that the globe's collective intelligence capacity seemed really good this time around, didn't it? Where the predictions were being made. Many Russians, if you go on Twitter, if you talk to people, they did not expect this war. They literally did not. When Putin kept saying, no war, no war, no war, that may be part of his problem. They did not expect this war. But I want to temper everything I'm saying by saying that protest and coup are rare events in the world. We tend to focus on them and stress them, but they're complicated, rare events, and they're still hard for us to predict, right? And so I'm making probabilistic arguments. I'm not predicting revolution anytime soon.
Excellent. So and we might have some more questions on the panel, but I want to give the students in the audience and online a chance to ask if anyone's got a Rob up in the front.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. I'm Rob Levinson. I'm a student here in the MAGR program. You touched on it a little bit. Everything we see, even from Russian sources now, is the casualty figures that they have experienced are amazing. Roughly, they seem to have lost about 3 times the number that the United States lost in Afghanistan and Iraq combined in 20 years of war. And it's been a month in the war, and they've lost something like 20,000 soldiers. Those are things you can't hide. I mean, you can hide from the public in general, but you can't hide from the families that their son or their husband or their brother is not coming home. How is that playing? Are people reacting to that? Are people feeling that in any way? Is that having any effect? Thanks.
Yeah, so I just recently saw that figure of 21,000 dead or missing. That seems very high to me. I know that figure was leaked by a Russian general, and I'm not sure we can trust it. I have seen sort of more verified figures of 13,000 dead, 4,000 missing. That seemed absolutely, that was my next sentence. That's still incredibly high. So I think what we're seeing again is strategic information released by the regime. They're releasing the information very slowly. They're letting people build their heroes, giving them, ceremonious funerals, having their parents be honored, paying people quite a bit of money for having lost soldiers in the war, showing people grieving at the gravesite, and so on. So right now, we're not seeing an overwhelming swell about the loss. Here, I think, is where either a lack of information or a willingness to look away, or both, is really creating a problem for the regime. Because pretty soon with these numbers, it's going to be very hard to look away. Every region is experiencing deaths. Deaths are no longer only concentrated in non-Russian or in ethnic republics. And so we're seeing really a change. There was a really remarkable protest over the weekend of mothers in Red Square in beautiful fur coats, protesting their sons perhaps being sent to the front. There's also been an uptick in the soldiers' mothers' protests. I know there's a lot of debate about why this falls to women. I don't know if it's sexist. It does fall to women. And in Russia, historically, women have been more skeptical about sending their sons to the military, whereas fathers, at least in my circle and in surveys, fathers tend to say, he'll be fine, it's a good experience, that kind of thing. So yes, I think this is another part of the gap between what Putin is saying about the war and what the reality of the war is, right? So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the war is coming to Russian territory now, and that's going to profoundly change people's feelings again. And that's going to be hard for us to predict. But I suspect it will harden support for the war among some groups, right? As things get blown up fires happen in Bryansk. There were fires in Bryansk today. So we're seeing a lot of that.
Hi, my name is Dalia. I'm from Lithuania, and I have a few questions for you. First one, I realized you mentioned Nevada Center for a few times. My question is, how do we trust these figures, as it is also a state organization, kind of? Because I feel like it's difficult to trust. And in my country, we've been talking that it's highly unlikely that Putin's popularity is as high as the center claims. Second question, regarding the protests. So I wrote last year my thesis also involving certain thoughts about protests in Russia. And I would like you maybe to comment a little bit on problems that opposition has in mobilizing the society, whether that be regarding generational divide, where people get information, and social situation, let's say middle class, lower class, higher class. How does that, in your view, disperse? And the last question, what is your opinion? Is this invasion of Ukraine, from your personal view and all the research you've done, is this more a question that it could have been avoided by not expanding NATO as far, or was it a Russian imperialist dream from the first moment, and it would have happened whether NATO expanded or not? Thank you.
So 3 more tiny questions. Thank you. So let me talk about Levada first. So I agree with you. In this environment, in this post-war environment, there are a myriad of reasons not to be trusting these numbers. And I talked about some of them. One thing Levada is doing, so I would say the reason that I trust Levada more than anyone else, even with all those caveats, is they report all of the methodological issues that we can use to assess their polls. And they now have on every, I was on Levada for a long time the other day, everything that you click on, they say methodologic explanation, right? So they're giving you those data. The second is that Denise Volkov, who now runs Levada, is the most honest researcher that I know in Russia. I've worked with him a lot for a really long time. We started working on the For Free Elections work. He has always been forthright about issues. They are a foreign agent, but they're not a state agent per se. They're not other types of organizations. So yes, let's all be super cautious. Let's be skeptical, but let's not, yeah, that's all I want to say. Let's be skeptical, but let's be thoughtful. One thing I wouldn't say I trust any one poll, but I do trust trends across polls more than I trust any single poll. And the trend we're seeing is a decline in support. That's interesting to me. I don't trust a single poll, but I do trust the trend. Protest. So look, I've been looking at, I'm going to start these 2 answers with the same thing. I've been looking at problems and mobilization in Russian society for almost 14, 15 years. And, you know, we can criticize Russians if we like, but the fact is that the US just went through a large scale mobilization called Black Lives Matter. And I would say protest rates, participation rates in Black Lives Matter probably look like Russian participation rates, right? So we have to remember that participating in protest is a rare event in any population. And so I think then, how do we compare, say, a large scale mobilization, the factors that shape mobilization in the US versus Russia? Well, on the repression scale, a lot of people did not participate in BLM because they were afraid of the police and police violence. So that's a big problem. When people are anticipating police violence, they don't go. Particularly young women don't go. Now that's changing in Russia. That's a really interesting thing that's changed in Russia, but also in the US, right? So we saw an increase in women attending these protests, especially young women. We see an increase in young women in response, the state response, by arresting more of them to scare them, right? So we see that happening. There's definitely a class factor here. There's a well-known sort of working class disdain for urban intellectuals and a well-known urban intellectual disdain for working class. They don't see their problems as being the same. They don't see their interests as being the same, and they find it very hard to collaborate. Here, again, I refer you to Jeremy Morris, an anthropologist who studies the working class, has been writing quite a lot about this on his post-socialism blog, and it's truly fascinating work. And he admonishes us to spend more time studying dirty politics, the politics of the people who don't want to participate, right? Who aren't pushing for democracy. Spend more time looking at them. And I think he's probably right about that. We see an urban-rural divide, although not in non-political protests. In non-political protests, small cities and regions are also very active. And there's a bridge between political and non-political protests. So we see that happening. So it's a really complex social dynamic that I think class is the biggest thing that we should be paying more attention to. The last thing. So again, when you've been doing this for a really long time, and I went to graduate school the summer the Soviet Union collapsed, talk about bad timing, right? And so I was watching through the 90s debates about what to do about NATO, and it was sloppy and it was difficult, and sunk costs were sunk. No one knew what to do with NATO. What would NATO become? There was a big debate about how to transform NATO. This is your job now, to think about how to transform NATO into the next movement. But do I think that this war was prompted by NATO expansion? I categorically do not. I think that, Partnership for Peace, it was a program to include Russia into the discussions of security, probably could have gone further. There were very many ways to create partnerships between Russia and NATO. Those opportunities absolutely were missed. So there were missed opportunities, but I really honestly don't think that was determinative. And also on the issue of imperialist expansion, I'm sure every one of us has a different idea about this, and a lot of it has to do with one Putin, many Putins. What did Putin think? Because, again, I've watched it for a long time. I don't think that, and as a friend of mine said, I'm just going to make a prediction, so when they open the archives in 2070, my grandchildren can say I was wrong. I don't think that it was a straight line between Putin's election and this war. I just don't think. I don't think that's the case. I think it was highly contingent. And especially if we want to explain why this war happened at this time, I would say it's even more contingent on how easy the Ukraine contest was, Crimea, how he thought, President Putin thought President Biden was too weak and too old. Yeah, he's really badly spoken, right? But he's not too weak, right? There's a difference there, how he expresses himself, how he comes across, and the kind of policies he's going to pursue. So I think I would have to say, you gave me an either or question. I would say neither are true, that there's a much more complex, nuanced story here that involves, and here let me finish with a discussion, a more fruitful discussion between international relations scholars, like actual international relations scholars, not these realists who say it's all the West's fault that Putin invaded Ukraine, and domestic politics scholars, and understand what's happening. One really interesting thing that I've been noticing is the same narrative disinformation strategy that Putin used to sell inside Russia he's using to sell the Arctic. He talks about the Arctic in the same terms. He talks about Ukraine in the same terms. And those narratives really start to crystallize in the like sort of, I would say 2008, 9, 10 period. Olya Malinova has a beautiful paper, an international relations scholar who traces Putin's narratives back to the early 2000s. She finds some of these themes. I'm not sure finding these themes draws us a straight line either. It just shows us something, right? But that's debatable. That's going to be the debate for the ages, honestly.
Excellent, thank you for that. I think we've got time for like one or maybe two more questions. So Megan.
Hi there, my name is Megan. Thank you for your time and your presentation. I was curious if you wanted to comment at all on Russian gas and how that's going to affect any decisions moving forward, particularly with Europe being so reliant on it. And also if you have any comments on the impact of Russia's economy. We studied in macroeconomics the inflation and the falling of the currency and wondered how that would change public opinion or Putin's stance in power. Thank you.
So yeah, these are the days where I wish I had stayed in economics and not political science, to tell you the truth. So, gas and oil is clearly part of this story. I've seen some very interesting analysis that I find quite compelling about Putin's effort to undermine climate change, and that this sort of expansionist policy at least is tangentially related to energy politics in ways we're not thinking about yet. And I think that deserves some more attention. You know, clearly the fact that money is flowing into Russia from Europe is helping Putin implement these strategies, like forestalling inflation or supporting the ruble. But I think that in some, I don't want to say that, it does look like Germany's under pressure to take serious steps. They've announced having dependence on Russian oil by the middle of the by the fall. That seems unlikely, but something to try. The US is behind the scenes. This is a moment where we think we know what's happening and we don't, but the US behind the scenes is doing some pretty hard negotiation. They've lifted oil sanctions on Venezuela, Venezuelan oil, and they're investing, companies are trying to invest to bring Venezuelan oil to the market. That's a very particular kind of oil. It's dirty, it does particular things. I'm not up on my oil types, but it will help. We see some UAE movement. There's pressure on Saudi. I think that we're going to see two things happen. One, and of course, US energy futures are up. I think we're going to see a couple things. China will buy all the cheap energy it can get. It's already locked Russia into low prices across the energy market. It will continue to do that. China will act in China's interest. So that won't be great for Russia, but it will be income. But I do think that this is going to really spur investment in green energy. And I think the thing to watch is whether nuclear power plants reopen or can be brought back online in Germany as the Greens. Ironically, for someone like me who lived through the anti-nuke movement in the 1980s, that's what I did in college, was protest nuclear power plants, right? Now that seems short-sighted maybe, but maybe technology is just better. But let's watch and see what the Greens can do about nuclear and clean energy.
Excellent. So I think we've got time for one last question. Does anyone in the audience have one for us? Or I can turn it back to our panel if anyone. Yes, I'm down.
So I was wondering if you'd like to, or if you have any comments on the ICJ court hearing where Russia made certain allegations and Ukraine did take it to the ICJ. However, Russia refused to attend that first court hearing and they accused Ukraine of committing a genocide. and that was their justification for the invasion. So I was just wondering if they believe that so strongly, or that was the image that they were portraying domestically, why wouldn't they take it further by attending the ICJ court hearing? Because nothing really could go that wrong by attending the hearing, apart from actually promoting the propaganda that you have going on right now.
I think there are a couple answers to that question. One is that whataboutism has been a Putin strategy from the beginning, and we can expect whataboutism to go across all of these charges, no matter how minor or how serious. And I think that's what we're seeing. There are plenty, if you read these stories, The Guardian, Sean Walker, The Guardian's doing amazing work interviewing. The Guardian's doing good work in general, but if you look at some of these stories, BBC, I know the BBC has all sorts of problems, but they're traveling around Russia interviewing people, and they're hearing this story. The Ukrainians are committing war crimes. So that whataboutism argument has traction. I believe, and if someone's an international human rights scholar, you can correct me, but I believe that the change to the Russian constitution in 2020 put the Russian courts above all international courts. I know that to be true. So therefore delegitimizing the courts, and so then taking them off the hook from having to ever engage these court hearings, right? And I think that that's, again, I don't think there's a straight line between Putin doing that. I think that had more to do with opposition cases going to courts than the International Criminal Tribunal. But I think that's probably the reason. For just the Constitution now says that international jurisdiction doesn't hold in Russia above Russian courts. But I'm sure someone can correct me if that's wrong.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much again, Professor Smyth, for joining us today. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but this was a really wonderful talk. So
Great.
we're glad to have
Thanks,
you.
you guys.
Thank you.